Welcome everyone to this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio. I'm Tim Grady. I'm here with my host friend from the last 26 years, Lou Weiss, who is the president of All Metal and Forge Group that sponsors Manufacturing Talk Radio, and they manufacture open die forgings and seamless rolled rings. And we were kind of yakking it up with our guest, Dr. Chris Kuehl of Armada Corporate Intelligence, who joins us today. And we drag him on the show under the guise he's going to talk about the Credit Managers Index report, which he does, and then we drag him all over the conversation to other areas. So, Chris, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoy being dragged into conversations. I mean, when you're an economist, you're constantly looking for new victims to talk to, because anybody that's heard you before just begins to run the other way, put their fingers in their ears, and go to their happy place. So it's always good to have new audiences.
Well, we may have to talk then about farm animals later.
Exactly. I do live in Kansas, therefore farm animals are a part of daily life here. So
yes, I'm sure.
So let's talk about the Credit Managers Index, which comes out from the National Association of Credit Managers. And just to thank them, please go visit them at nacm.org. Chris, what's going on with the credit managers? Are they tearing out the little hair they have left, or are they getting implants?
They're in pretty good shape right now. Just quickly, for people who are not familiar with the Credit Managers Index or NACM or credit managers in general, these are the people that determine what kind of terms you're going to get when you're buying machinery or inventory or anything it is that you're purchasing from a company that is part of your supply chain. So the supply chain, in a way, ends up being somewhat determined by the decisions on the part of credit managers, because they're trying to determine what situation you will be facing as a company when the time comes for you to pay them. Credit managers, as a result, tend to think a little bit into the future. They're not terribly concerned about how you are doing today. You don't owe them money today. You owe them money in 30, 60, 90, 120, 180 days. So they're looking down the road. So whenever you look at credit manager data, you kind of have to think in the back of your mind, this is where they think we're going to be in 2, 3, 4, 6 months. Much of what is the value of the CMI is that predictability. And in a way, the Credit Managers Index often predicts the Purchasing Managers Index, because frequently the credit manager does what they do before the purchasing manager does what they do. So with that said, what we saw in the CMI this month was stability, and we don't normally see stability. We often see at least part of the index going up dramatically or going down dramatically, or at least enough to merit some commentary. This month, it was pretty much like last month, which is pretty good news, because most of the numbers last month were good. We separate the index into two categories, favorable and unfavorable, from the perspective of a credit manager. So the favorable things are sales, dollar collections, amount of credit extended, and number of new applications for credit. The sales numbers have been up in the 70s for a while, and this is an index where anything over 50 is good, anything under 50 is contraction. So when the numbers are in the 60s and 70s, that's really good. The more interesting thing is that the amount of credit extended jumped up into the 70s, and it hadn't been that high before. What the credit managers are attributing this to is kind of related to the supply chain, and we've talked about it on this show before. Because people are worried about the supply chain and because they're worried about inflation, they are tending to buy more now than they normally would. They're trying to prepare for higher prices down the road. They're also worried about access to materials, so they're perhaps buying more than they ordinarily would because they're worried about supply. The polite word for this is stockpiling. The impolite word is hoarding. And companies are doing a certain amount of that, and the credit managers are noticing it. And it's making them a little bit nervous, because they're saying, well, you're asking for a lot more credit than usual, which is okay, but you're counting on demand soaking up that inventory next year. And what if it doesn't? Are you going to be in a position where you're not going to be buying anything more into the coming year, or are you going to struggle to pay back the money that we've basically offered you as trade credit? So there's a little bit of concern showing up with the credit managers. The negative categories are things like accounts out for collection and disputes and slow pays and customer deductions and bankruptcies. Those are not as robust as the favorables. They have been, for the most part, above 50, but not by much, like 51.3 and 50.2. And a couple of them have actually fallen into that contraction territory with numbers high 40s, but still in the 40s. The biggest concern on the negative side is that you're getting a lot more accounts out for collection activity, which is making the credit managers a little bit nervous. Slow pays have become a bit of a problem, but bankruptcies are still not an issue. The bankruptcy numbers are still in the high 50s. So the indication is that there's some problems occurring, but they're not serious enough to really put companies in jeopardy at this stage, which is relatively good news. So the overall conclusion is steady as she goes, I guess. We are kind of coming into a period of recovery. If you look at a lot of the other indicators, PMI numbers were saying that earlier this week. The latest job numbers are a lot more confident than we thought they would be. So we're kind of going into the last quarter in pretty good shape. We're just hoping that that carries through into next year.
Let me present the other side of that coin.
Yes, please do.
And this, yeah, this is almost too much of good news coming from an economist. My question is, aren't we sort of setting ourselves up for the big collapse?
It depends. It's one of those things where we're setting ourselves up for our usual dependence on consumers. And the consumer is kind of back in control. For about a year, they really weren't, because they didn't have the opportunity to consume. They were limited by all the different things we were doing around the pandemic. So now we're back to our normal situation where the consumer is driving everything. The reason that they're doing so well right now is they still have a lot of accumulated money from all the stimulus we did the last 2 years. That stimulus is ended. And now the money that they're spending, that's what they have. And if they blow through that, then there really isn't necessarily more to come. On the other hand, our unemployment rates are now very low, 4.6. So the majority of people who want a job have a job, and many of them are getting paid more than they were before because they've had more leverage. The assertion is that we are going to see a fairly strong spring in terms of consumer spending. The worry begins later in the year because now you start to see things like interest rates going up. You start to see inflation taking a bigger bite out of people's income. You start to see the companies struggle a little bit, and those workers start to get a little more nervous. So the expectations are that we've probably got another 2 or 3 months of pretty good growth. Then by the middle of next year, it starts to slow down, and we'll end up with growth that's about what it used to be, anywhere between 2.5 and 3.5. We've kind of gotten used to, second quarter was 6.5, third quarter dropped 2. And that felt like a full-on recession, even though all it was doing was going back to normal. Next year is probably going to be normal, but it's going to feel worse because we haven't been at normal for a couple of years.
Well, and what about this new phenomena, the great resignation that's going on?
Oh, yeah. I mean, part of what's been driving me nuts about the way the media has covered a lot of this stuff is that some of the most obvious influences don't get discussed. We've been talking all about jobs and we don't have enough people, and people don't want to work anymore and blah blah blah. And it's like, folks, this is demographics. Boomers are getting older. They may still be dressing like they're 22, but they're not. And the fact is that we've been losing 10,000 boomers a day to retirement, and we've been doing it for several years. That's 3.5 million people a year coming out of the workforce. And not that many years ago, you could count on boomers to kind of stay in longer than normal. But the pandemic forced more than a few of them out. And they said, look, I mean, I don't have to work. I'm retirement age. It's too much of a risk. I'm going to stay out. So the shortage of people and all the resignations has been predictable. It's just demographics. The only way that we solve that problem is, have more kids. I mean, change child labor laws. I mean, if they're old enough to play video games, then they can program. What the heck? I mean, get them a job. And we're not big on immigration. And even now, even as we try to figure out what to do with immigration, we're trying to lure the talented people from around the world, which everybody else wants as well. So it's a little bit different environment. And then, of course, you get the usual media hysteria about things over which the media shouldn't be hysterical. Inflation has been driving me nuts, and I'm sure this will get me in trouble. But the guy that invented Twitter was talking the other day about how we are on the edge of hyperinflation. And I just have to remind people that the first four letters of Twitter is twit, and that pretty much describes that gentleman. Hyperinflation is 50% inflation per month over a period of time. This is when prices change by the hour. We have never had hyperinflation. We never will have hyperinflation until, of course, the aliens attack and the world comes to a halt. This is Weimar Republic in the 1930s deal. And it's like, we're not dealing with that. We're not dealing with stagflation either. Stagflation is when you have high growth and high unemployment. Unemployment's 4.6. We're not even close to a stagflation situation. What we have is higher than normal inflation, which is in itself enough of a problem without trying to scare people with idiotic references. And when the thing that you invented is for twits that can't communicate in more than 26 letters, why are you so proud of yourself to begin with? That's just me.
Well, that's great. Tim, when we get off, we're going to call our lawyers.
Yeah, that sponsorship deal is gone now.
Yeah.
I want everybody to know that the opinions that expressed here are those of the guests, Manufacturing Talk Radio, or its affiliates, assigns, owners, subsidiaries,
Exactly.
and people.
And my business partner is somewhere going, no, don't say that. No, that's not Armada. That's just him.
Well, I'm going to throw you a wild one, Chris, and it gets real volatile. So I'll let you field it however you want, saying I'm not going to answer that.
Very good.
We're approaching zero growth for population in the United States.
Right.
And since 1973, Roe v. Wade, we have stopped the birth of 60 million Americans. So we've shot our own foot off, and we're not the only country doing it. China's one-child policy hurt them tremendously. The Scandinavian countries, which also allow abortion to take place quite freely, have the same problem. So we're looking at a worker shortage, and it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right. I mean, population dynamics has changed so dramatically because at one point, the average family size was 4 or 5. I mean, you had large families, and you don't have to go back all that far to have families of 8, 9, 10 kids. That was the way you survived. That was the way that you had people to take care of you in your dotage. And the problem has always been, no matter what society you're dealing with, is the people with the most money have the fewest children. They want that money for themselves. They don't necessarily want to spend it on large families. And so you've had larger families in poorer populations than you have in the richer populations. So not only are we not having as many children, no matter what country you talk about, but we also don't quite know what to do with the children we're having. We're not necessarily changing the education system to accommodate the needs of society. we squander productivity because a lot of the kids are not getting the education that is needed. And it's not that they're not necessarily being educated, but there's never been a good connection between the education system and the business community, and neither communicates very well with the other. So what business people want, they're not necessarily getting from the education system, and the education system often doesn't know what it is that business wants, and it creates a constant dilemma. All I ever hear from people that don't work in manufacturing is, why don't you train your own people? Why are you waiting for somebody else to do it? And then I try to point out that 75% of manufacturers in this country have less than 25 employees. And I've heard the drill. I mean, the guy will go to his senior guy and say, "Hey, I just hired Skippy here. I want you to train him." And the senior guy goes, "Seriously? Are you going to give me a raise? No. Are you going to give me less to do? No. So I'm already working a 50, 55-hour week from you, and you want me to train this idiot who doesn't even know how to turn the machine on? No." And given that the number one way that manufacturers recruit now is poaching each other, that guy just looks at his boss and says, "Just because you ask me to do this, I'm going to go to work for the guy across the street, because that's absurd that you think I'm going to train this kid." And the company is basically saying, look, we've got to have a pipeline so at least the kid knows a little before we have to set about training him for our job. And we don't create that pipeline in most cases. I mean, states, if there is any orientation towards that kind of training, is coming from state and local governments, not necessarily from the federal side. And when people keep asking, well, what can federal government do? I said, train. It's like, you're really big on setting up new regulations, and you're very excited about new taxes, and you're constantly bleeding on about creating jobs. You don't create jobs, business does. And it would be nice if you were able to create people to take the jobs that business has on offer, considering there are 10.3 million of them that are going unfilled right now. So there's just a lot of skewed priorities. And not only are our family sizes smaller, we don't do as much immigration as we used to. That's a complicated issue because we don't want more unskilled people. We want skilled immigrants, but so does everybody else. The Europeans, the Asians, they all want those same people.
Well.
Well, Lou actually has created something called the Circle of Uncertainty and Insecurity, which is going to be headlined in our upcoming issue of Manufacturing Outlook, and put all of these words and phrases that make a business person a little nervous and uncomfortable because there's so many unknowns. And Lou and I have discussed many times, Chris. Yeah, the ISM number is in the 60s, and the services number is in the mid 60s, and IHS is 58.3, and it all sounds wonderful, but we're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop because it doesn't feel wonderful.
Yeah, it's so much of the growth this year is not artificial. It's real enough that it's bounding back from 2020. I mean, going forward, economists are going to look at 2020 and 2021 as both anomaly years that you can't really compare anything to. 2020 was a catastrophic recession, which was imposed by government edict. We'd never had anything like that before. Every other recession had some kind of an origin in some sector. 2008 was the banking and housing sector. We knew where the problem was. This time it was like, we're doing fine. March of 2020, we're just barreling along. All of a sudden, attention, attention, everything is closed. Don't talk to anyone. Don't speak to anyone. Cover your face with a plastic bag. Avoid all contact with all human beings for the rest of your life. What? Oh, okay. And oh, by the way, 70 million of you just lost your jobs. And oh yeah, about 800,000 companies, you just went out of business today. And it's like, what the hell?
And 1 million people died.
Yeah, could I have gotten just a little heads up, 20 minutes, 15, something? I mean, this is kind of like having NASA announce that the moon just shifted out of orbit, will hit in about an hour. So, you know, whatever you've been putting off, you've got 60 minutes, so go for it. It was an anomaly, and then bouncing back from it has been just as much of an anomaly, because once the pressure was lifted, people tried to go back to their old habits as fast as they could, and sort of overdid it. So 2022 becomes the year that we kind of rediscover normal, and we'll find that many of those problems didn't go away, and we sort of have new ones to pile on top of it. Most of the things that we observed in the last year had been happening prior to 2020, but just not at that speed. We were already doing online, we were already going to remote work, we were already changing, we already had labor shortages in manufacturing, construction, transportation. That wasn't new. We already had a supply chain that was in trouble, but it wasn't as obvious as it's been in the last 2 years. So I agree with you. 2022 is a lot more mysterious to me than people are making it out to be. I think it's going to be an adjustment year. Some will do very well, but others are going to struggle, because these things are going to start catching up with them to a degree. And on the other hand, you'll have some reactions that will be positive. We've talked about the number of companies looking at reshoring now because they've lost faith in the supply chain. And I've been asking on all the groups that I've spoken to in the last couple of months, specifically the last couple of days, I was talking to bankers, the Illinois bankers and the Kansas bankers. And I said, well, according to the research, companies are looking to reshore. Are you seeing that? And all the bankers said, yep, absolutely. Number one question we're getting right now, companies saying, hey, I'm moving back from China, Vietnam, wherever. Can you help me get land? And how do I get a loan to do this? And I'm moving back a bunch of people. Where are they going to live? Is there housing here? And the banks are like, oh yeah, we're getting hit with this every day. So it's a real enough phenomenon which will benefit us medium term, but in the short term, it's like, yay, they're all moving back, and we don't have enough workers now.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I was already jumping off of my stool here. You bring back 1 million, 2 million jobs. You're not bringing back people. You're bringing
Right,
back jobs. And on this side of the ocean, you don't have the people. We
right.
don't have the people now, but you're going to bring back 2 million more. Maybe we should start using prisoners and retrain them. I mean, Tim
Well,
and I were talking about that 6, 8 years ago.
right. Well, one of the things that's being suggested now is there's a lot of pressure mounting to say, look, we want to bring this work back to the United States, and we need all these workers. Well, guess what? A lot of our current workers in these other countries would love to come with it and come live in the United States. But the inhibition is they can't get visas. And so the pressure now is, look, I've got a bunch of great workers here in Vietnam, and they're all like, yeah, I've got relatives in Vietnam. Can I come too? And I've got relatives that live in LA. So, hey, I want to come back. And from a strictly economic perspective, it's one thing to try to deal with somebody who's desperately seeking access to the United States from horrible circumstances in their home country. It's quite another for somebody who's a skilled machinist in China saying, yeah, okay, I'm 26 years old and I live in China and I'm a skilled machinist and I have no problem at all living in Nebraska. Can I come to the US?
Yeah, very true. The other thing I think where we're going to find some workers, Chris, is the automotive industry.
Right.
The automobile has several hundred parts to create its drivetrain and engine, and the
Right.
electric one has 20. So there
Yeah.
are going to be a lot of people leaving manufacturing here to go to manufacturing there because their jobs aren't needed anymore.
Right. And I think one of the things, and you bring up another issue, which is how fast will some of these transitions take place? Because we hear a lot of conversation about the rise of alternative energy and all that sort of stuff. Well, we saw some of the limitations this year. The European energy crisis is due in no small part to the fact the wind didn't blow in Europe this year. They got 20% of what they expected to get from their wind farms, which is why they ended up being more dependent on natural gas. And the Russians took full advantage of this to be the creeps they usually are and restricted gas supply. So it's one of those things that, yeah, alternatives are great, but understand that you're dependent on whether the wind blows or the sun shines, and it doesn't always. The Energy Information Agency did a report, and they're generally very interested in alternatives and all the rest. And they said by the year 2050, we will still be 76% dependent on fossil fuel globally. So coal will be about a quarter, gas will be about a quarter, oil will be about a quarter, and the amount of power that's coming from alternatives will have increased by 7%. And that's about it. And the utilities keep pointing out, saying, well, look, if we all go electric, you do realize that we have to produce the power that goes into those cars. So you may not be using as much gasoline, but we're going to be using more coal and oil and gas to build the utilities to fuel those cars. Do you not remember Texas a couple years ago, where a bad winter literally caused us to black out almost the entire Southwest? We didn't have enough capacity. Where would we have been if we had all the electric vehicles that you're thinking of having? And bottom line is 2.6% of the US fleet is electric. So we're a long way away from even having a significant contribution from the electric industry. So these are all, they're on their way, but they're decades from now. And people are continuing to talk about it like, yes, we're going to be an all electric country by next Thursday. No, we won't.
Lou?
Well, I'm more depressed now than when I got on the show.
Well, see, you started out by saying I was being optimistic for an economist, so I had a reputation to defend.
I understand.
It's like, my God, these people are happy. I can't have that. So
you painted a interesting picture, which I, by the way, agree with. Good part of it. I think that, when you refer to the new normal, there is no new normal. This is the way it is, and it's going to be this way and continue to be this way. And the old normal is dead and gone. And
even if we could figure out what the old normal was, because I mean, every company that I ever deal with, I mean, they just laugh when people talk about anything being consistent, because everything changes, particularly in a manufacturer's life. The manufacturer is always in the most unenviable position because they're dealing with downstream and upstream. They're trying to figure out what's happening with their suppliers, with commodities, with all the things they use, over which they have no control. And then at the same time, they're trying to figure out what the customer is doing. And even if they're selling into an OEM, you're selling into an automobile manufacturer. Well, ultimately, it's still going to depend on what Joe Public wants to buy. And all it takes is for gasoline prices to jump by 50, 60, 70 cents a gallon. And suddenly people want to buy fuel sippers again. And the auto industry is like, well, I thought you didn't like fuel sippers. Well, we don't, unless gas is expensive. But as soon as gas comes down again, we'll ditch those puppies and go back to our trucks and SUVs. And the auto industry goes, you do realize it takes 4 or 5 years to get a car ready for production? Oh, no. We want to change our mind by the hour. And it's like, well, what? Consumers are beyond a doubt the most, they're squirrels. They change their minds instantly. I mean, if you want to understand consumer behavior, literally just watch a squirrel trying to cross the street, and you will quickly understand the dynamic.
Well, on that note, I don't know if I can take much more of this, Tim.
Well, we appreciate you being with us, Chris, and sharing your insights, which are pretty sound, but great analogies. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Chris. See you next month.
See you next month. I'll be happier, maybe.
Yeah, we'll have to work on that.
Thanks.
You take care.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of Manufacturing Talk Radio. We encourage you to go to nacm.org, which is the National Association of Credit Managers, for the report that they have. And while you're surfing, stop by jacketmediaco.com, where you can find this episode and all of our previous ones, along with our additional podcasts, and a link to the Manufacturing Outlook digital e